So now to our distinguished guest, Professor Esther Turnhout is the chair of Science and Technology Studies in University of Twente. She was originally trained as an ecologist, but made all the way to Science and Technology Studies. And as you remember, the topic of this conference is the future of biodiversity research, overcoming barriers. And one of the big barriers we have to overcome is between disciplines. And so it's very meaningful that we have Esther here with us today. She has an extraordinary career, being contributor for IPBES, several of the IPBES assessments. Currently, we're just discussing about the transformative assessment, where Esther is a lead author. And I'm quite sure it will be a thought-provoking presentation to you, Esther. Thank you so much. Oh, you can ask. I forgot one thing. Thank you. There is in UVA, you can ask questions in the UVA app. And so during the talk, you can start asking questions. You can vote on the questions. So we'll be taking questions both from the UVA app and from the audience in the end. Yeah.
All right. I hope everyone can hear me properly. Good morning. Thank you for joining. It's a bit daunting to look at all of you. You're with a lot. Thank you very much for Enrique for this kind invitation. Thank you for the organizers for having me. It's a true pleasure to be in Leipzig, and it's a real honor to be able to speak to you. All right. So I'm going to start by stating the obvious. We are in the middle of a polycrisis, a situation of intersecting environmental and societal problems. Not just biodiversity and climate change, but also growing inequality between and within countries. Now, these crises are the result of common underlying root causes, particularly dominant imperialist and capitalist political economic structures and systems. Now, tackling these root causes is potentially an effective and just way to tackle these crises simultaneously. But this is not what we are overwhelmingly doing. Instead of closing the proverbial tap, it appears that science and policy are mostly working on ways to mop the floor more effectively and efficiently by means of what Holly Jean Bach and colleagues have called stopgap measures. Conservation is one of these stopgap measures that prioritizes proximate over underlying causes, and that mostly as a result of this fails to recognize or address the ongoing destruction of nature. Several of you will have seen this figure. It certainly made the waves at various side events at the COP in Montreal. It shows that conservation alone, even if we would fully implement it according to existing agreements, will not be sufficient to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. Yet despite this, the Montreal Kunming Agreement overwhelmingly prioritizes stopgap solutions over more transformative options. We actually see a very similar lack of transformation in how we organize the relationship between science and policy. The linear model, which is depicted here on the slide, assumes that science needs to be separate from society and policy in order to produce objective and neutral knowledge that then go on to inform society in its efforts to make rational decisions. Now, despite overwhelming evidence that this linear model is not working, and despite repeated calls for changing research priorities and approaches to actually improve the contribution of science to action, this linear model continues to dominate how we conceive of and organize science policy society relations. So this is interesting, right? despite clear failure, there's actually little change in our approaches to save biodiversity, and there's equally little change in our strategies to link science to action. In collaborative work I did with Mariana Larsen, we asked the question, why are we not making more progress? What is stopping the scientific community from doing things differently? Now, the short answer to this question is depoliticization, but I will go through this argument in 4 parts. Part 1 is framing. As we all know, facts cannot speak for themselves. We interpret, we make sense of, and we articulate facts. And this is how facts become inevitably entangled with values and assumptions. And framing is not just inevitable, it produces political effects. Scientists and policymakers frame facts in definitions of what the problem is. And these problem definitions shape the solution space. They influence what will be seen as rational and effective options for action. And they also determine what knowledge we need to produce to understand these problems and inform these options. Now, this becomes really tricky in situations of unequal power relations. This is because certain frames of research problems or societal and environmental problems are much more dominant than others. And this dominance can even lead to a situation where these frames become naturalized. This means that they no longer appear to us as fact-value entanglements, but as reality, as nature, or as rationality. The knowledge inequities that this creates should not be underestimated. Only 5% of published literature in the agricultural domain is relevant for smallholder farmers. And of total science funding for climate change, only 0.12% goes to social sciences. This means that vital knowledge that can support alternative food systems or overcome climate obstruction is simply not being done. Now, looking at the history of conservation from the perspective of framing makes clear how conservation is historically entangled with and complicit in the ongoing exploitation and destruction of nature, either under state governance, colonial rule, or by large corporations. I will give 3 examples of this. The first example is German scientific forestry. In the book Seeing Like a State, James Scott discusses how science produced methods and tools to optimize forest management, to optimize the extraction of timber while, of course, maintaining the resource base. As the story explains, what happened is that they created an ideal type, the Normalbaum, or the normal tree. Now, what happened is that this Normalbaum was not just used to represent forests and to help management. No, it was actually used to create forests. If actual trees could resemble the Normalbaum as closely as possible, this would support the efficiency and the effectiveness of forest management. But this came with unanticipated consequences, which ultimately threatened the forest itself and the timber that it produces. It became clear that these optimized forests weren't actually very resilient, and they were very vulnerable for diseases or storms. So optimization backfires. A second well-known frame of nature is wilderness. This frame lies at the heart of the go-to strategy in conservation, protected areas. This has resulted in large injustices because it has justified the removal of people from the areas that they inhabit and depend on, while they are not responsible for the destruction of nature that created the need for these protected areas in the first place. And it also produces injustices by ignoring the ongoing destruction of nature by more remote actors actors that in some cases use the money that they continue to make from the destruction of nature to actually fund these protected areas. A third example is the frame of nature as carbon. Now, this is, of course, the result of the increasing prominence of climate in the conservation space. In this frame, the main value of nature is the carbon that is stored in trees. Programs like REDD+ aim to reduce deforestation by developing an incentive scheme that will support local communities in leaving their forests standing. This again unduly responsibilizes local actors while ignoring continued deforestation for large-scale agriculture. Now, what I want to show with these three examples is that dominant frames reflect and determine both research and political priorities. They invite policies that focus on the optimization of the delivery of these priorities. What the examples also show is that this comes with negative consequences. The policies are unjust, they lack effectiveness in conserving nature, and they can end up jeopardizing the priorities themselves, partly because optimization backfires, but also because policies ignore the underlying causes of nature's destruction. Part two of the problem is neutrality. Many see neutrality as indispensable for good science, but it is not just unattainable, it is actually harmful. In this quote, Julia Steinberger discusses the use of so-called negative emission technologies in IPCC modeling. It is well known that the technologies that Steinberger refers to, including direct air capture, carbon storage, or massive tree planting, are extremely unlikely to ever be effective at sufficient scale. Yet the existence of these technologies in modeling does mean that their imagined potential climate benefits can be calculated. And as we are currently witnessing, these imagined future benefits are used in the present to advocate for the avoidance of the delay of reduction of emissions. So, as of course, social movement activists have for long recognized, neutrality in a situation of unequal power relations means that you side with power. Now, this problem is closely related to the third problem of relevance. Global science policy bodies like IPBES or IPCC have as their mantra that they should be neutral and relevant. This shows the continued dominance of the linear model in science policy interfaces. Now, many scientists, including probably many of you in this room, have the ambition to be relevant. But again, we need to recognize what knowledge is seen as relevant. This is the knowledge that fits with the frames of powerful knowledge users that are also able to fund research and that supports the policies that they can accept. So what we end up with, as this quote tries to depict, is a circular relationship where science and policy interact through common frames. In another paper, we have called this circular relation measurementality. And in the figure, we have used the concept of ecosystem services as yet another frame of nature that shapes research and policy priorities. The figure illustrates how through mutually reinforcing feedback loops, the frame of nature as ecosystem services becomes naturalized. Nature is increasingly seen to really exist of ecosystem services that can be measured and assessed by science, thereby enabling evidence-based rational policies that aim at efficiently managing the continued supply of these services. And in that process, of course, alternative frames of nature have very little chance of entering into the domain. So what we see is that the norms of neutrality and relevance result in the depoliticization of science. it allows science to ignore the role of framing, and it enables science to present their knowledge as representing the reality and the policies they inform as the rational options. Now, while some might celebrate this as an example of an effective science policy interface, what we see if we look more closely is a situation in which science willingly subjects itself to power, in which it serves for the twin processes of conservation and exploitation, and in which it supports those policy options that are preferred by dominant actors, exactly because they do not threaten the status quo. This, I would say, is greenwashing. Now, there are examples in science that have tried to improve the relation between knowledge and action and prevent the domination of single frames by incorporating diverse perspectives and diverse forms of knowledge. However, as I will show later, also these approaches have unfortunately fallen victim to depoliticization. You might start with diverse perspectives, as I tried to show on the left of the slide, with diverse perspectives working together in an equal manner. But what you often end up with is a situation where they've all become yellow, one is considerably bigger, and it eats the others. Arguably, no science policy body has done more to emphasize the importance of diversity than IPBES. The recent values assessment has done wonderful work to recognize the diverse ways in which people know, value, and live with nature, and to emphasize the importance of incorporating this diversity to enhance the effectiveness and legitimacy of knowledge and of policy. Yet also IPBES reduces diversity. This happens through diverse mechanisms. In a review article about IPBES, we identify three: through the way in which experts are selected, the role of dominant approaches in assessments, and the drive to consensus. For the purpose of this talk, I want to focus on the second one. My experience in interdisciplinary collaboration, including in research projects, committee work, and in global integrated environmental assessments, is that these spaces are dominated by particular, mostly natural science-based integrated frameworks. The DIPSIR model is one of these dominant frameworks. And you can see also how the structure of the IPBES global assessment closely follows this model. Now, these frameworks define what counts as interdisciplinarity. They define the puzzle, so to say, in which the different disciplinary pieces should then be made to fit. Knowledge that does not fit within these frameworks, for example, because it has a very different conception of causality, knowledge that resists these frameworks, or knowledge that questions the frameworks will be excluded. And this means that it's been hard for critical social sciences and humanities scholars that have very different epistemologies and ontologies have been able to sit at the table of IPBES, but have not been able to fully and equally contribute to the work. The ironic result is actually that interdisciplinary research will actually consider the reduction and co-optation of diversity as a requirement for its success. Now, this brings me to the concluding part of my lecture. So what I've shown that we have is that we have a dominant system. You could say that this is an environmental truth regime in which science serves vested interests and reproduces the status quo. I've also shown that it does this in four interrelated ways: through supporting the naturalization of frames, through serving dominant interests while presenting this as neutrality and relevance, and by co-opting diverse perspectives and forms of knowledge. This results in a rather bleak conclusion. that science has itself become an obstacle for transformation. Not the transformation of itself, but also the transformation for biodiversity that we need science to support. And it does this because, and I will repeat the argument here for the sake of clarity, because accepting dominant frames counts as neutral and relevant, while questioning them or proposing alternatives is seen as political. And not just political, but also as irrational and anti-science. Now, this results in science uncritically subjecting themselves to vested interests, and it justifies the continued exclusion, marginalization, or co-optation of those perspectives and forms of knowledge that could actually make a difference. So we have to do better. On this slide, I outline a number of ingredients for a better knowledge that are connected to the problems I've discussed in this lecture. What they call for is pluralism. What we need to do is to create a radically pluralist knowledge landscape where all different biodiversity frames have the opportunity to shape research and to shape policy making in an equal fashion. We need to do this because we are very far removed from this situation. We need to do this not just by elevating marginal perspectives, but we need to also start disempowering dominant frames and the scientists and policy actors that benefit from them. This is particularly important when dominant frames are intolerant of pluralism, because they prefer to present themselves as the truth or the reality, as in singular. After all, as Karl Popper has famously said, the only thing that tolerance cannot be tolerant of is intolerance. Yet it is, of course, the question if science is up for the task. The anti-colonial scholar Audre Lorde poses the urgent question whether the master's tools can dismantle the master's house. And this is a pertinent question in this case. If science has historically been a tool for the exploitation and destruction of nature, and it continues to do this, can it really be expected to radically change course? Can we fix the problems with the tools that also created the problem in the first place, right? To paraphrase Einstein. There are reasons to answer this question with no. We've seen the parallels between the lack of change in our approaches to knowledge and the lack of change in our approaches to biodiversity. It's ironic, astonishing even, that it is those scientists that continue to call for transformative change of everyone else in society and in our economies that have continuously resisted proposals for transformation themselves. Clearly, also within science, we face the challenge of overcoming vested interests that actively work to obstruct change. Yet I see it as my obligation to continue to resist giving up hope and push back against taken for granted frames and problematic norms that dictate what it means to be a good scientist. Therefore, I would like to end with 2 examples of what it might mean to produce better knowledge. And I'm sure that you will also have many more. The first I wanted to show here is our project Biotraces. This is an international project funded by Horizon Europe, where we undertake action research to politicize the status quo and to support radical alternatives in their resistance against the status quo. In our case study, we do research with stakeholders, and we do this by actually joining their social movements. A second example is a course in which we invite PhD students to reflect on their own research projects, to think about how it can be changed to make it more transformative, and to do so in creative ways. For example, by elevating plural perspectives, by empowering actors, by exposing or challenging power, and by embedding research in emancipatory practices. We will teach the third rendition of this course this April at our campus at the University of Twente. And so far, it's been a truly transformative experience for all students and also for the teachers. I'm often troubled by being an academic. If there's so many things wrong with science, what am I doing here, right? This is a question I almost ask myself on a daily basis. It's very difficult to try to engender transformation from within a broken, unequal and colonial institution such as our universities are. Yet I refuse to give up on science and on the potential of critical scholarship. As I probably have made clear, this will be a struggle, but I hope you will join me. Thank you for your attention.